Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 239 of Game Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. On this show, we discuss the craft and the art of game mastering. I've been running RPGs for over 28 years now, and I produce this show in the hopes that you can benefit from my experience, my triumphs, and my mistakes. I have a great show for you today. I'm bringing you another episode in my series of deep dive discussions of the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition D&D. So I have been going through the Dungeon Master's Guide page by page and discussing it with you and giving my thoughts and insights and ideas as they're relevant to what we're covering in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So we started all the way back in the introduction of the book, and we've worked our way up to chapter 5. And I have all of those episodes linked in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey. So if you are new to the show and you want to check out the previous episodes, you can find them all linked there. So it's super easy for you to find what you're looking for. And I also have linked there all of the Player's Handbook episodes I did, very similar to these episodes about the Dungeon Master's Guide, where I went through the Player's Handbook and focused in on the material really important to Dungeon Masters. So I didn't so much talk about spells and character classes and abilities and things like that. I focused more on the rules of the game and running the game and all of the wonderful information for Dungeon Masters in the Player's Handbook. So check those out as well. Today, I return to our exploration of the Dungeon Master's Guide, and we are still working our way through Chapter 5, Adventure Environments. And, you know, it occurred to me when I was preparing for this episode that I don't know that I've talked a whole lot or even mentioned the fact that the DMG is laid out into 3 parts, and I kind of like the way that they laid this out and divided it into 3 parts. So those 3 parts are part 1, Master of Worlds, which is chapters 1 to 2. Part 2, Master of Adventures, which is chapters 3 to 7, and that's where we're at today. And then part 3, Master of Rules, which is chapters 8 to 9. And I think I did talk about in the very beginning of this series how I like the way that they laid out the DMG in that they begin with world building. So if we go all the way back and kind of recap some of the stuff we've covered in this series so far, you know, we had the introduction, which is just kind of introducing you to the game, explaining the role of the Dungeon Master, and going over these 3 parts of the book and talking about what those 3 parts are going to cover. And then we have a bit of a discussion on knowing your players and the different types of activities different players enjoy in the game. And that's something we discussed quite a bit on a previous episode. I believe that was the first episode in the DMG series. So you can find that linked in the show notes for this episode at starwalkerstudios.com. And then we go into chapter 1, A World of Your Own. And it's talking all about creating your own world, and all the things you want to think about when you're creating your world, or even if you're using someone else's setting, whether it's an official published setting or a friend setting or whatever, just things you want to think about whatever world you're using in your game to flesh it out and, you know, kind of know where you're at. And then chapter 2 was creating a multiverse, which is all about the different planes in D&D and how all that works. And then that was the end of part 1 of the DMG, which again is Master of Worlds. And I really like that this DMG starts out with the world building stuff as opposed to starting out with a bunch of rules and optional rules and all that kind of thing. And it's very possible I'm reading way too much into this, and even likely. However, I think it's kind of interesting to look at not only these three sections, but the order in which they're presented and the amount of material that's devoted to each. And at least for me, I think that this says something. So the fact that the first thing we talk about in the DMG is being a master of worlds is your setting, where the adventures take place, thinking about the world and the gods and how magic works and how explored things are, how dangerous things are, and all that kind of stuff. To me, this is saying, as a new dungeon master or as a dungeon master who's new to Dungeons and Dragons and going to run this game for the first time, my first focus, the first thing I think about should be my setting, should be the stage that this story is going to take place on, because context is everything, right? The setting really matters. The environment that the player characters find themselves in really matters, because that's what they're going to be reacting to, and that's what's going to shape their perceptions and everything that happens. So I think it's really cool that this Dungeon Master's Guide begins with world building, begins with the setting and the stage that the players play on, and is kind of telling you, I think, as a new DM, using this book as a guide, hey, this is the first thing you want to think about before you even sit down to play with your players. Think about where these adventures are taking place and how the world and the setting and the history and all those things are going to affect what happens and affect the options that the players have and the choices that they make. So then the second part of the Dungeon Master's Guide is Master of Adventures. And here, we start out with chapter 3, creating adventures, talking all about, steps in creating an adventure and what a good adventure should have, and helping you through that process. And then chapter 4, creating non-player characters, which are all the characters that populate your world that aren't played by players. And then chapter 5, adventure environments, which is where we're at today, which is all about the places your adventures take place, whether that's a dungeon or in a city or some fantastic location. And then after that, we go into between adventures, which is downtime. Then we go into treasure and things like that. And then we get into part 3 of the book, which is Master of Rules. So again, I just want to point out the order of that these are presented. So first we're presented with setting, stuff. And then we're presented with, okay, now that you know the setting, let's think about the actual adventures that the players are going to go on. And let's talk about how you create good adventures and how you create the places where those adventures take place and all that great stuff. And then it's only after all that, towards the back of the book, part 3, Master of Rules, that we start to get into the nitty gritty of how the rules work, how to interpret the rules, how to use the rules, variant rules, optional rules, different ways you can use the rules, and ways for you to create your own rules, your own monsters, your own spells, and things like that. So I think this says a lot. For a new DM, whether you've never run a game before or you're just new to Dungeons and Dragons, the first thing you want to think about is your setting, your world. Where is this going to take place? Are you going to run it in, Kryn? Are you going to run it in the Forgotten Realms? Are you going to use a setting of your own creation? Are you going to use a setting from maybe a fantasy book series or TV show or something that you really like? Or whatever, that's the first thing you want to think about is where are these adventures going to take place? And then next, worry about the actual adventures and telling a good story. And it's only after you've dealt with all of that that you need to concern yourself with the rules. And I think that's really important, because I think a lot of people who are not yet game masters, who are maybe thinking about it, think that the first place they should start, or the first place they're going to start, is the rules. And I think it holds a lot of people back from GMing or delays their start in GMing, because they think I don't know the rules well enough, or I don't want to know the rules well enough to be a GM. I don't want to just memorize a bunch of rules. And, I don't think that that is the most important thing as being a GM. And in fact, honestly, I think mastery of the rules is the least important part of being a game master. I think just like the DMG is laid out here, I think if you've got a solid understanding of your players and what they want from the game, and you're able to deliver that to them, if you have a solid grasp of your setting and your setting is interesting and compelling and something the players want to explore, and if you're presenting fun and interesting and engaging adventures, if you're doing those things, if you're a little weak on the rules, nobody's going to care, because they're coming to your game for the story. They're coming to your game for the adventures, for the fun. They're not coming to hear you quote rules to them. And really, for me, what's much more important than knowing the rules is knowing when to worry about the rules and when not, and pacing is really where it's at. And personally, I would much rather play under a GM who has good pacing and who keeps the game going, maybe doesn't know the rules, but is comfortable with just doing things on the fly and keeping the game going, as opposed to a GM who knows the rules very well, but will bring the game to a grinding halt anytime there's any kind of a rules question, and we're going to spend an hour trying to figure out the rules. So again, to me, I think mastery of the rules is the least important thing, and definitely should not be something that stops you from running a game, feeling like you don't know the rules well enough. So I think it's really interesting that they laid out the DMG that way and saved all that rule stuff for the very end. And then the other thing about that is the amount of attention that's given to each. And when you just look at the parts of the DMG as far as page count, Part 3, Mastery or Master of Rules, is by far the smallest section of those 3 sections. And actually, Part 2, Master of Adventures, is the largest and has the most pages devoted to it. So I think that's really interesting. And again, I'm sure I'm reading way more into that than the folks at Wizards intended. But I do think it's really interesting and informative that when we look at the DMG in that way, we see that the rules are given the least amount of pages to talk about, and they're saved for the very end. So to me, that's a further support for my belief that, that's the last thing you need to worry about as a GM. That's kind of the advanced stuff, right? If you're a brand new GM, I'd say, like I said, worry about the adventure, worry about your setting, worry about the story you're telling, and less so about the rules. Worrying about the rules is kind of where you go once you're kind of solid on the other stuff, right? Then you start thinking about, hey, let's come up with some unique spells for my world that I'm going to create, or I'm going to create my own magic items, or my own sub races or subclasses, or whatever. That's something that you go to when you're ready for that, and when things are running smoothly. Otherwise, you don't want to start out there, I don't think. So yeah, that's just something to think about if you are a newer GM. Don't let knowledge of the rules or lack of knowledge of the rules hold you back. All right, so today we are back in Chapter 5, which again is in Part 2, Master of Adventures. Chapter 5 is Adventure Environments, and we've previously talked about dungeons, we've talked about urban settings, we've talked about wilderness as an adventure environment, we've talked about traveling through the wilderness, how to approach that. We've talked about mapping, all kinds of good stuff. And this is the final section in this chapter, and this is about traps. So traps are going to be most useful probably in a dungeon environment or something like that, are probably going to be less useful in a wilderness because, traps usually aren't something that occur naturally. They're something that's constructed by someone. So you're less likely to come across them in the wilderness than you are in a dungeon or in an urban environment. Traps can definitely be something that you encounter in an urban environment, especially if you're trying to infiltrate a vault or something like that. So let's see what the DMG has to say about traps. Traps can be found almost anywhere. One wrong step in an ancient tomb might trigger a series of scything blades, which cleave through armor and bone. The seemingly innocuous vines that cover over a cave entrance might grasp and choke anyone who pushes through them. A net hidden among the trees might drop on travelers who pass underneath. In the D&D game, unwary adventurers can fall to their deaths, be burned alive, or fall under a fusillade of poison darts. A trap can be either mechanical or magical in nature. So that's going to be our two major qualifications of traps. They're either mechanical or magical. Or another way to say it is they're either magical or they're not. Mechanical traps include pits, arrow traps, falling blocks, water-filled rooms, whirling blades, and anything else that depends on a mechanism to operate. Another way I often think about it is mechanical traps tend to be the most likely to have real-world analogs. So a lot of the mechanical traps we see in the game are traps that exist or have existed in the real world. Magical traps, not so much. Magical traps are either magical device traps or spell traps. Magical device traps initiate spell effects when activated. Spell traps are spells such as Glyph of Warding and Symbol that function as traps. So, that's what a trap is. Traps in play. When adventurers come across a trap, you need to know how the trap is triggered and what it does, as well as the possibility for the characters to detect the trap and to disable or avoid it. So as a GM, those are the basic things you need to know about any trap you're going to use. How is a trap triggered? How could a PC set it off? What does the trap do when it is triggered? And how hard or easy is it for the PCs to detect the trap before they spring it? And if they do detect it, to disable it or avoid it. So let's go through these. Triggering a trap. Most traps are triggered when a creature goes somewhere or touches something that the trap's creator wanted to protect. And, that's a great way to approach traps as far as creating traps and putting them in your adventure is why is this trap here, right? The trap is there for a reason. So think about why the person who put the trap there or built the trap or created the trap, what is their purpose for the trap? What is that trap trying to protect? It might be trying to prevent entry into a room or an area, or prevent something from being opened, like a treasure chest or a coffin or a sarcophagus. It might be protecting a treasure. There's all kinds of possibilities, but the trap is there for a reason. And once you know that reason, it will help inform further decisions about that trap. So common triggers include stepping on a pressure plate or a false section of the floor, pulling a tripwire, turning a doorknob, or using the wrong key in a lock. Magic traps are often set to go off when a creature enters an area or touches an object. Some magic traps, such as the Glyph of Warding spell, have more complicated trigger conditions, including a password that prevents the trap from activating. All right, so now that we know why our trap is there and what triggers the trap, the next thing that we need to know is how do we detect and disable the trap? Usually some element of a trap is visible to careful inspection. Characters might notice an uneven flagstone that conceals a pressure plate, spot the gleam of light off a tripwire, notice small holes in the walls from which jets of flame will erupt, or otherwise detect something that points to a trap's presence. A trap's description specifies the checks and DCs needed to detect it, disable it, or both. A character actively looking for a trap can attempt a wisdom perception check against the trap's DC. You can also compare the DC to detect the trap with each character's wisdom perception score, each character's passive wisdom perception score, to determine whether anyone in the party notices the trap in passing. All right, so this is a really important thing to kind of hang a lantern on here. This is something that a lot of GMs get confused about and players get confused about. So if players are just, say, walking through a dungeon and no one's really making a concentrated effort to look for traps, no player has said, hey, I'm going to look for traps, and you're wondering, are they going to notice this trap that's in the room? All you need to do is compare the DC of the trap with the passive perception of the characters in the party. And if their passive perception is equal to or greater than the DC of the trap, then they notice it without having to actively look for it. They're just that aware of their surroundings that they notice it. Another thing I want to point out here is where it says, usually some element of a trap is visible to careful inspection. Notice that says usually. It doesn't say always, right? So that means that usually, most of the time, there's going to be something about the trap that can be seen and detected without setting off the trap, which is where that passive perception score comes in. You know, you can see if just someone notices it without even trying too hard to notice it, or where the perception check comes in. If you have one or more player characters that say, hey, I want to look for traps, then they make a perception roll. And if they beat the DC of the trap, they notice it. But that, again, is in most circumstances, usually when there is some element of the trap that is visible, but that is not always the case. And there are going to be times or certain traps where there is no element of the trap visible. And in those cases, there is no chance to detect the trap unless the characters are using some kind of magic like the detect trap spell, or there's the wand of secrets, which will allow you to detect traps. But if they're just using normal perception and there's nothing there to perceive, there's not some element of the trap that is visible that would tip them off that there's a trap there, then it doesn't matter what their passive perception is. It doesn't matter what they roll on a perception check. They can't detect the trap because it's undetectable. And you don't have to take my word for that. There are numerous examples of this in the published adventures for 5th edition D&D that have been put out by Wizards, where there are traps that are not able to be perceived or detected, or can only be perceived or detected when certain conditions are met. So there was one adventure, I think it was Curse of Strahd, but I'm not 100% sure of that. But there's one specific instance I remember where there was a trapdoor that was under a rug in a room, and the description of the room said that the only chance the player characters had to detect that trapdoor was if they looked under the rug. So if a player character was just relying on their passive perception, they wouldn't detect that trapdoor. If a player said, I search for traps, no matter what they roll, they wouldn't detect that trapdoor. The only way a player could detect a trapdoor was if a player said, I look under the rug. In which case, in this instance, if I remember right, it was automatic. Like if someone said, I look and see if there's anything under the rug, they find the trapdoor automatically. Or you could have a more cunningly disguised trapdoor under the rug, in which case the player character would have to say, I look under the rug. And at that point, you would check their passive perception or have them make a perception check, or probably better, make a perception check for them to see if they are able to find the trapdoor, because it's so well hidden that just looking under the rug doesn't guarantee that you're going to find it. So you can have situations like that where the trap is concealed in some way, and only if someone looks in the right place or moves a tapestry or something like that do they have a chance of seeing it. Or you could have a trap where there are no gimmies, there are no giveaways that the trap is there, and there's just no way to detect it without using some kind of magic to do so. So keep that in mind. And again, it's giving you examples of things that would give you a clue that a trap is there. So again, there has to be some kind of clue that the trap is there in order for a perception check, whether passive or active, to be able to detect that trap. I've said this many times on the show, but I think it's worth repeating. Just because a character rolls really well on the D20 doesn't mean they can do something that's impossible. That's not what that means. So if the adventurers detect a trap before triggering it, they might be able to disarm it, either permanently or long enough to move past it. So once they've found a trap through either passive perception or an active perception check, you could then call for an intelligence investigation check for one of the characters to figure out what needs to be done to disarm this trap. And then once they figure out how to disarm it, a character could attempt to disarm it using a dexterity check using thieves' tools to perform the necessary sabotage. So, there's some things I want to point out here. First of all, in dealing with a trap, there are 3 steps involving 3 different roles and potentially 3 different characters, because usually, different characters are going to be better at these different roles. So first, there's either a wisdom perception check to find a trap, or you're using the passive perception of the characters to see if they detect a trap if they're not actively looking for traps. So first they have to detect it. If they detect it, then they have to figure out how to disarm it, which involves an intelligence investigation check. And then once they know how to disarm it, they have to actually disarm it, which requires 2 things. It requires proficiency with thieves' tools, and it requires a dexterity check using the thieves' tools. And another thing that can be a little confusing about 5th edition is how tool proficiencies work. And just remember that in 5th edition, anytime you have a proficiency in something, whatever it is, it doesn't matter, you get to add your proficiency bonus to any roll involving that thing. So using thieves' tools, for example, whether to pick a lock or to disarm a trap, is a dexterity check, okay? However, if you're proficient in thieves' tools, which I think you pretty much have to be to use them, you would add your proficiency bonus to that check. So to disarm a trap, for instance, it's a dexterity check. And since you're using thieves' tools and you're proficient in thieves' tools, you add your proficiency bonus to that check in addition to your dexterity bonus. Any character can attempt an intelligence arcana check to detect or disarm a magic trap. So that's cool too. Any character. You don't have to be a magic using character, and you don't have to be proficient in the arcana skill. Because again, if you're calling for an intelligence arcana check and someone doesn't have arcana, it's just intelligence. So anybody can make that check. It doesn't have to be the wizard. It doesn't have to be the sorcerer or the bard. Anybody can do it, and they don't have to have the arcana skill. Although obviously that's going to greatly improve their chances of success, because if they don't have it, they're just relying on their intelligence bonus. The DCs are the same regardless of the check used. In addition, Dispel Magic has a chance of disabling most magic traps. A magic trap's description provides the DC for the ability check made when you cast Dispel Magic. So let's kind of illustrate this with an example. So let's say we have a trap, and the trap is let's say a mechanical trap, and it specifies it's a DC 15 trap. That means to detect the trap is a DC 15. So that means to just notice it without really looking, a character would have to have a passive perception of 15 or higher. Or if a character is going to actually look for traps, which takes an action, they're going to make a wisdom perception roll, and they need to be a DC 15 to detect the trap. Once the characters detect a trap, in order to figure out how to disable that trap so they can get past it without triggering it, they need to make an intelligence investigation check, again, DC 15. And then once they succeed at that, in order to actually disable the trap, they need to make a dexterity check with thieves' tools, again, DC 15. Really simple. But complicated in that there are 3 separate roles involved with the 3 separate steps. And, I think that's what confuses some GMs is sometimes they don't realize there's 3 steps there, and they think, oh, it's just one roll to detect the trap and to know how to disarm it. And then they're like, well, do I use perception or investigation? And it's like, well, you use both. You use perception to detect the trap. You use investigation to know how to disarm it. And then you're going to use your thieves' tools to actually disarm it. And of course, at any of those stages, you could fail. I'll also remind you, just a general rule, that characters can help one another. So if a character helps, then they give the character doing the action advantage on the roll. So you might have the whole party actively looking for traps, in which case usually you'd have the player with the best perception score make the roll, and they would do that with advantage since other people are helping them. I'm not going to take the time to look it up right now. I'm pretty sure this is in the rules somewhere, or if not, at least it's the way I do it. With things like thieves' tools, I require a character to have proficiency in that to help. I don't see how a character who's not proficient in thieves' tools could help a character with thieves' tools pick a lock or disable a trap. So you would need two characters proficient in thieves' tools in order to have someone help the character pick the lock or disarm the trap. But if that does happen, then they would get advantage on the roll. And again, the main difference with a magical trap versus a mechanical trap is that instead of using perception to detect a trap, we're using intelligence arcana. And instead of using thieves' tools to disarm the trap, we're also using intelligence arcana for that. But it would still, I believe, it doesn't specify this here, but it doesn't say otherwise. So I would assume that you would still use intelligence investigation once you detected the magic trap to figure out how to disarm it. In most cases, a trap's description is clear enough that you can adjudicate whether a character's actions locate or foil the trap. As with many situations, you shouldn't allow die rolling to override clever play and good planning. And I would also point out, you shouldn't let your dice override what makes sense or what seems possible or likely or unlikely. Use your common sense, drawing on the trap's description to determine what happens. No trap's design can anticipate every possible action that the characters might attempt. You should allow a character to discover a trap without making an ability check if an action would clearly reveal the trap's presence. So there are going to be times that player characters may discover a trap without having to roll just because they do the right thing. For example, if a character lifts a rug that conceals a pressure plate, the character has found the trigger and no check is required. And again, that's assuming that plate is obvious once you lift the rug. A really cunning trap designer might further disguise the plate. So even if you lift the rug, you don't automatically see it, and then you'd have to make a roll. So again, the trap's description should give you enough information that you can figure this kind of stuff out and just do what makes the most sense to you. Foiling traps can be a little more complicated though. Consider a trapped treasure chest. If the chest is opened without first pulling on the two handles set in its sides, a mechanism inside fires a hail of poison needles toward anyone in front of it. After inspecting the chest and making a few checks, the characters are still unsure if it's trapped. Rather than simply open the chest, they prop a shield in front of it and push the chest open at a distance with an iron rod. In this case, the trap still triggers, but the hail of needles fires harmlessly into the shield. So again, part of being a GM is using logic and reason and common sense to make decisions and to adjudicate situations where the rules fall short or the rules just can't anticipate exactly what's happening at your table. And it just takes practice, but just, use your common sense. Do what makes the most sense and seems the most realistic to you. Traps are often designed with mechanisms that allow them to be disarmed or bypassed. Intelligent monsters that place traps in or around their lairs need ways to get past those traps without harming themselves. Such traps might have hidden levers that disable their triggers, or a secret door might conceal a passage that goes around the trap. And that's another thing to think about when you're using traps. Like, let's say you're placing them in a dungeon, is thinking about how the people that live in that dungeon and work in that dungeon, how do they deal with the trap? They don't want to be, triggering the trap all the time themselves. So like this says, they'll either have a way to disable it or get around it or something like that. And those are always things to think about. Another thing to think about is, for instance, in the dungeon, if you have a trap on a door that goes into a room, and the player characters come to this door and encounter this trap, they might assume like, hey, no one's been here ever or in a long time because this trap was here. And if someone had been here recently, the trap would have already been triggered, unless it's some kind of trap that can reset itself. It would have already been triggered and we wouldn't have encountered it, right? So you want to think about that too. Make sure things hold up to reason when players start investigating things. If you have this dungeon and all the doors are trapped and yet there's people coming and going from the dungeon all the time, does that make sense? Unless they have a way to bypass the trap, right? Another great way, you can use a trap without having to take the time to really spend much time with the trap at all, is have players, especially in like a dungeon, like say a tomb that has traps protecting the tomb from tomb robbers, have player characters encounter traps that have been triggered already that are no longer a threat to the player characters, but can serve as foreshadowing that, hey, there's traps in this dungeon. So, let's say you create a dungeon with a bunch of traps, and maybe you have player characters who don't normally look for traps or just kind of brazenly charge through dungeons. And you're concerned that they might, have a bad end because they're not being careful enough and you've got a lot of traps. You could have them very early in the dungeon encounter a trap that's been triggered by someone who entered the dungeon before them. And, so maybe they find like a corpse that's been impaled by spear, like some kind of spear trap, right? So right away that establishes some danger. And it also tells the player characters, hey, there's traps here and they're deadly because here's a previous adventurer who was killed by this trap and maybe we can loot his body or whatever. But that's a great way to telegraph to the player characters that, hey, there's traps in this dungeon. You might want to be a little more careful than you normally are. Or, a way I've used this technique before is if I want to have traps in the dungeon, but I don't want to spend time on them, like maybe a session's going kind of long and I want to get, a little further in the adventure and there's a trap and I don't want to spend a bunch of time dealing with the trap, is I'll just on the fly decide that the trap has been triggered by either a denizen in the dungeon or a previous adventuring party or something like that. And in that way, I still have some of the impact of having that trap there, but we don't have to spend a bunch of time with the player characters trying to find the trap and disable it and deal with taking damage from it or whatever. We can just go on. So that's something you can do too. Trap effects. The effects of traps can range from inconvenient to deadly, making use of elements such as arrows, spikes, blades, poison, toxic gas, blasts of fire, and deep pits. I'd also add that any spell in the game can be used in a trap pretty much. So, if you're running out of ideas for traps, just start flipping through the spells in the player's handbook and think about how, that could be a trap. Like you could use the burning hand spell, could be in a magical statue that breathes fire on the player characters or whatever. You could use lightning bolt spell, could fire out of a trap or whatever you want to do. Sky's the limit. The deadliest traps combine multiple elements to kill, injure, contain, or drive off any creature unfortunate enough to trigger them. So that's another thing to think about when you're designing a trap. What is the goal of the trap or the person who built the trap? Is the goal to just keep people out? Is it to kill invaders? Is it to just drive people away or to trap them so that they can be used for experiments? Or is the goal to injure them? Maybe for some reason, not kill them, but just injure them. The attack bonus of a trap, the save DC to resist its effects, and the damage it deals can vary depending on the trap severity. Use the trap save DCs and attack bonuses table and the damage severity by level table for suggestions based on 3 levels of trap severity. So we've got setback traps, dangerous traps, and deadly traps. A trap intended to be a setback is unlikely to kill or seriously harm characters of the indicated levels, whereas a dangerous trap is likely to seriously injure and potentially kill characters of the indicated levels. A deadly trap is likely to kill characters of the indicated levels. So we've got 2 tables here, And these are really useful both for designing traps as you're preparing for an adventure. And also if you ever want to just spring a trap on the fly during play and just add a trap, as you go, these tables are really useful to do that, because you can just, as far as the mechanics of the trap, use these tables and then come up with whatever description or flavor to describe the trap that you want. So we've got trap save DCs and attack bonuses. So again, we have this based on whether it's a setback, a dangerous, or a deadly trap. So this is kind of weird because this isn't based on level at all. So this is, it doesn't matter. I guess if your characters are first level or 20th level, they're going to get the same DCs for a setback, dangerous, or deadly trap. So that seems kind of odd to me. I don't know. So for instance, a setback trap has a save DC of 10 to 11 and or an attack bonus of +3 to +5. A dangerous trap has a save DC of 12 to 15 and or an attack bonus of +6 to +8. And then a deadly trap has a save DC of 16 to 20 and or an attack bonus of +9 to +12. Then we have the damage severity by level, and this does take into account the level of the player characters and gives us different damages, whether we want a setback, dangerous, or deadly trap. So for instance, characters 1st to 4th level, a setback trap will do about 1d10 damage, a dangerous trap will do 2d10, and a deadly trap will do 4d10. So there's a couple things I want to point out about this. First of all, there's no reason you can't mix and match these different things. So for instance, as far as the attack bonus or save DC of the trap, maybe you'll use the values from a dangerous trap, but then for the damage it does, maybe you'll use the values for a setback trap or a deadly trap. You can kind of fiddle with these different knobs however you want. The other thing I'll point out is always think about average damage. So for instance, the 1st to 4th level setback is 1d10 damage. So the average for 1d10 is 5.5. Dangerous trap is 2d10 damage. The average of that would be 11. And then deadly is 4d10 damage, or average damage of that would be 22. So, you don't have to have all your traps use d10s. That'd be pretty boring, right? So you could use different damage dice. You just want to think about what is the average damage going to be and what are the minimum and maximum damages going to be. So for example, let's take 1st to 4th level characters. A dangerous trap does 2d10 damage. All right. So that's a minimum of 2 damage, a maximum of 20 damage with an average damage of 11, right? 2 times 5.5 is 11. So those are our values for that. So what if we tried different dice? So let's see, average of 11. How else could I get an average of 11? Well, let's think. If I roll a D6, the average is 3.5. So 2d6, the average would be 7. And 3d6, the average would be 10.5. So that's pretty close to 11. So I could, instead of using for my 1st to 4th level dangerous trap, instead of using 2d10 damage, I could use 3d6 damage. Has about the same average damage. However, where it's going to be different is in the minimum and the maximum damage. So minimum and maximum damage for 2d10 is 2 minimum, 20 maximum, right? Well, 3d6 minimum is 3, but maximum is 18. So with my 3d6 trap, the average damage is about the same. However, the minimum damage is a little more, but the maximum damage is a little less. So you can fiddle with these things to really dial in what you're looking for. Maybe I want a trap that has pretty high average damage, but the minimum and maximum damage aren't so extreme. Or maybe I want a trap that's more swingy, as they say, that has a larger spread, that has a larger maximum damage compared to its average. So in general, if you want your minimum and maximum, how can I say this? On average, if you want a higher minimum damage, you want to use more dice, right? Like we saw with the 2d10. I mean, the minimum you can roll on a die is 1, right? That's always going to be the case. So your minimum damage is always going to be the number of dice that you're using. So 2d10, the minimum is 2 because I'm using 2 dice. 3d6, the minimum is 3 because I'm using 3 dice. 4d4, the minimum is 4 because I'm using 4 dice. So if I want a higher minimum damage, I can use more dice. And if I want the average to be comparable or the same, or if I or the max damage to be the same, I can use more smaller dice, right? So, 2d10 maximum is 20, 3d6 maximum is 18, 5d4 maximum is 20. So we have the same maximum damage there of 20, but with 5d4, my minimum goes up from 2 all the way up to 5. And then let's see, what would be the average of 5d4? It would be 5 times 2.5 would be 10, like 12 and a half, I think, just doing that in my head. That might not be right. But anyway, you can play with that. And if you're going to do this stuff, a calculators can be really helpful. So you can play around a lot with using different dice to really dial in where you want your minimum and maximum damage to be and where you want your average damage to be. And, this doesn't just work with traps. This is like if you're designing monsters and you're thinking about how much damage their attacks do, it's the same kind of thing. But if you don't want to mess with all of that, you can just use what's suggested here and just use D10s. There's nothing wrong with that. So to give you an idea of kind of the scale of this, if we go up to characters of 17th to 20th level, our setback traps now do 10 D10 damage. Our dangerous traps do 18 D10 damage. And our deadly traps do 24 D10 damage. So just as a further example here, let's say I was doing a dangerous trap at 17th to 20th level, does 18 D10. If I wanted it to be more swingy, if I wanted there to be more of a spread between the minimum, average, and maximum damage, instead of using 18 D10, I could use 9 D20 and, have more of a swing that way. So those are just things that you can think about and play with. Now we're going to talk about complex traps. So up to this point, we've been mainly thinking about simple traps where, there's just one thing that happens basically. Complex traps work like standard traps, except once activated, they execute a series of actions each round. A complex trap turns the process of dealing with a trap into something more like a combat encounter. When a complex trap activates, it rolls initiative. The trap's description includes an initiative bonus. On its turn, the trap activates again, often taking an action. It might make successive attacks against intruders, create an effect that changes over time, or otherwise produce a dynamic challenge. Otherwise, the complex trap can be detected and disabled or bypassed in the usual ways. For example, a trap that causes a room to slowly flood works best as a complex trap. On the trap's turn, the water level rises. After several rounds, the room is completely flooded. And that's it. That's the entirety of what we're given as far as guidelines and systems for traps in the DMG. What follows after this are some examples of traps. And here we have the collapsing roof, the falling net, the fire-breathing statue, pits, which are mechanical traps, poison darts, poison needles, rolling sphere, hello, Indiana Jones, and sphere of annihilation. So I'm not going to go through all these, but just to kind of go through some examples, let's go through a mechanical trap, and then let's go through a magical trap. So let's see, looking here at the mechanical traps, let's do the rolling sphere. That sounds fun. So this is a mechanical trap. When 20 or more pounds of pressure are placed on this trap's pressure plate, a hidden trap door in the ceiling opens, releasing a 10-foot diameter rolling sphere of solid stone. So this basically just tells us what the trap does and tells us that the pressure plate requires 20 or more pounds. So if one of the player characters somehow weighs less than 20 pounds, they're not going to set the trap off. With a successful DC 15 Wisdom Perception check, a character can spot the trapdoor and the pressure plate. That also means if a character has a passive perception of 15 or higher, they will automatically notice that pressure plate. A search of the floor accompanied by a successful DC 15 intelligence investigation check reveals variations in the mortar and stone that betray the pressure plate's presence. So they're helping you understand how this trap works and how a character might disable it, which I really enjoy that they do that with traps in 5th edition. It really helps you as a DM describe the trap and deal with it. The same check made while inspecting the ceiling notes variations in the stonework that reveal the trapdoor. And again, that's an investigation check. Wedging an iron spike or other object under the pressure plate prevents the trap from activating. Now, you may notice something here, and this is intentional. This is by design. Notice here that there is an action which will disable this trap, which is wedging an iron spike or other object under the pressure plate. Okay. So this means it is possible. You might have the following scenario. Player characters come into the room with the trap. Someone's got a high passive perception, 15 or higher, and they just automatically notice the trap. Or someone says, I want to look for traps. They make a wisdom perception roll and they roll a 15 or higher, notice a trap. People see the trap. You describe the trap to them. You describe the pressure plate to them, right? Maybe they make the investigation check to try to figure out how to disarm the trap and they fail that check. Or maybe they don't even bother with an investigation check. But either way, let's say a player character says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take this iron spike out of my explorer's pack and I'm going to wedge it under that pressure plate. That is the correct action to take to disable this trap. So at this point, it doesn't matter if they rolled investigation or not. It doesn't matter if they succeeded on the investigation roll or not. The player has, or the character has done the thing they need to do to disable the trap. So it doesn't matter. Do you see that? So again, the dice don't rule everything. You know, if you describe a trap and the players deduce how to disarm it on their own and they do that, don't screw them over because they didn't make an investigation check or they failed that check. I mean, I guess you could say, well, your character isn't smart enough to figure it out because you failed to check. So I'm not going to let you do that. But honestly, I think that'd be a pretty dick move and I wouldn't do that. I'd be like, hey, if the players figure it out, good on them. I'm going to let them proceed with disabling the trap. Now, I would still ask for the check with the thieves tools to see if they're able to do that without setting it off, because it seems like that would be something that requires a little finesse, and there could be a chance while you're trying to wedge that thing under there that you could actually trigger the trap. So that's where the dexterity check with thieves tools comes in. Now, again, you know, you could decide how to adjudicate that. Now, normally I would say any kind of a check requiring thieves tools, like picking a lock or whatever, would require you to have proficiency with thieves tools to be able to attempt that check. But there can be exceptions. Everything's situational. So here we're talking about wedging a rod or a spike under a plate. I don't think you need proficiency in thieves tools to be able to do that. So in that case, I could either say you can attempt that with thieves tools or with an appropriate tool that would work, like the iron spike. And obviously, if you have proficiency in thieves tools, you're going to get, you know, your proficiency bonus. If you don't, you're just not going to get your proficiency bonus. It's just a dex check and, you know, good luck. Or if I really think that the thieves tools are required, like for instance, picking a lock, and I just did this in a recent game. I had a player character wanted to pick a lock. They weren't proficient in thieves tools. And I asked myself, how complex is this lock? Because I think a simple lock, someone could pick with thieves tools without being proficient in it, just with a good roll. They got lucky. They figured it out. A more complex lock that wouldn't be possible. So I decided for this particular lock that it was simple enough that you didn't have to have proficiency in the thieves tools. So what I did is I gave the character disadvantage. So they were able to do it. They just had disadvantage because they didn't have proficiency. Or I take that back. I actually gave the character disadvantage because they were using a bobby pin. They weren't actually even using thieves' tools. So, everything's situational, right? So you just got to think about what makes sense. So to me, using a bobby pin, I mean, it could work. I know enough about how lockpicking actually works to say, okay, you could do that with a bobby pin. It would just be a lot more difficult to do, right? So I'll give you disadvantage. And in this particular instance, the character was a bard and had jack of all trades. And so I factored that in too. I was like, well, you don't have proficiency in thieves' tools, but you do have jack of all trades. So I'm going to let you do it. You're just going to have a disadvantage because you're not actually using thieves' tools. You're using a bobby pin, right? If the character didn't have jack of all trades, I might not have let them attempt it because I'm like, there's just too many things against you. A, you don't actually have thieves' tools. You're trying to improvise with a bobby pin. And B, you're not even proficient in thieves' tools to begin with. So this is kind of beyond you, is probably what I would have said. But again, you just got to make a judgment call based on your judgment. All right, so back to our rolling sphere. So we talked about disabling the trap. Activation of the sphere requires all creatures present to roll initiative. So if this trap is triggered, you instantly have everybody roll initiative. The sphere also rolls initiative and has a +8 bonus on that roll. Then on its turn, it moves 60 feet in a straight line. The sphere can move through creature spaces and creatures can move through its space, treating it as difficult terrain, which means it takes twice as much movement to get through that space. Whenever the sphere enters a creature space or a creature enters its space while it's rolling, that creature, or while the sphere is moving, that creature must succeed on a DC 15 dexterity saving throw or take 10d10 bludgeoning damage and be knocked prone. The sphere stops when it hits a wall or similar barrier. It can't go around corners, but smart dungeon builders incorporate gentle curving turns into nearby passages that allow the sphere to keep rolling, like a giant pinball machine. As an action, a creature within 5 feet of the sphere can attempt to slow it down with a DC 20 strength check. On a successful check, the sphere's speed is reduced by 15 feet. If the sphere's speed drops to 0, it stops moving and is no longer a threat. So there's a pretty complex, simple trap of the rolling sphere and how it works. And you see there, all the checks were DC 15, DC 15 perception to notice the pressure plate, DC 15 investigation to disable the pressure plate, DC 15 dexterity saving throw to avoid taking damage and being knocked prone. One thing that's interesting is the strength check to slow down the sphere is actually DC 20 instead of 15. So again, you don't have to make all the DCs the same if you don't want to. It's your trap. Do whatever you want. All right, so now let's look at a magical trap. Let's just look at the Sphere of Annihilation. Magical impenetrable darkness fills the gaping mouth of a stone face carved into a wall. The mouth is 2 feet in diameter and roughly circular. This trap is in a very famous dungeon. I won't tell you which one. No sound issues from it, no light can illuminate the inside of it, and any matter that enters it is instantly obliterated. A successful DC 20 Intelligence Arcana check reveals that the mouth contains a sphere of annihilation that can't be controlled or moved. It is otherwise identical to a normal sphere of annihilation as described in Chapter 7 Treasure. So here's an example of taking a magic item and turning it into a trap. So not only can you do this with spells, you can do it with magic items. You could do it with monster abilities like a red dragon's breath weapon. Why not? Make that a trap. Some versions of the trap include an enchantment placed on the stone face, such that specified creatures feel an overwhelming urge to approach it and crawl inside its mouth. I can't imagine why that would be the case, but okay, wizards. This effect is otherwise like the sympathy aspect of the antipathy sympathy spell. A successful Dispel Magic DC 18 removes this enchantment. So again, this is showing that usually a well-written magic trap will tell you the DC needed for a Dispel Magic to disable the trap. And, that is more using the rules for Dispel Magic and the spell involved in making that trap than necessarily the trap rules. So that's definitely an instance where your DC may be different because that's based on the spell and what level it was cast at and all that good stuff. So yeah, that's what we've got in the DMG about traps. There is more about traps in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, including much more guidance given to complex traps and how to use those. I do want to discuss at least parts of Xanathar's Guide on this show in the future. So if you'd be interested in hearing a discussion of the traps material in Xanathar's Guide, please let me know. You can shoot me a message on Twitter or MeWe, or shoot me an email at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com.
This is Matthew Colville, and you're listening to Game Master's Journey.
So one thing that I want to discuss a little bit here that is not mentioned in the DMG, and I'm kind of surprised that they don't talk about this, is the impact that traps will have on your game, because they will have an impact, especially with dungeon crawls. I mean, this is the classic example. I talked a little earlier about how you can telegraph or foreshadow traps in your dungeon by having player characters encounter a trap early on that's already been triggered, and maybe encountering the remains of a victim of that trap if you really want to drive home that these traps are dangerous. So another part of that is the impact that's going to have on the player characters and the players specifically, and how they're going to approach that dungeon. My experience has been pretty much universally with every group I've ever run in a dungeon setting, or any kind of a setting where traps might be present. As soon as you show the player characters a trap, whether they find one that's already been triggered or disarmed, or they encounter one themselves, as soon as they see a trap in this environment you've set up, it will impact most likely the way they approach that environment going forward. So let's just say it's a dungeon. They're going to start looking for traps in every room. They're going to be much more cautious and suspicious of everything. If they see a lever on a wall, they're going to assume it's a trap. If they see a treasure chest in a room, they're going to assume it's trapped. They're going to be poking around with 10-foot poles, all that kind of stuff. And that's fine, but it's just something to be aware of as a dungeon master that will affect the pacing. And this is an element of pacing that you as a DM don't have a lot of control over, because you don't want to be dictating how the players play the game, right? If they want to check every room for traps and they want to spend 10 minutes of real world time on every room examining everything for traps, that's their choice. Let them play the game the way they want. Your opportunity to control that came and went at that point. Your opportunity to control that is if and when you're going to have them encounter a trap, let's say in a dungeon. It's the easy example. They're exploring a dungeon. Let's say you've decided there are going to be traps in this dungeon. The next decision is, where are those traps going to be? And you can totally just approach this as, where would it make sense that there would be traps, and put traps there and call it a day. But you also might want to think about this effect it has on how the players approach the dungeon. So if you want the players to be super cautious and take forever to explore every single room and check every step they take with a 10-foot pole first and that kind of stuff, and you just want this like agonizingly slow progress through the dungeon, then introduce traps very early. Have them encounter a trap right away at the entrance or whatever. And now you've told them, hey, there's traps, you better be careful. And most good players, or at least experienced players, will be careful from that point forward. If, on the other hand, you don't want to take forever to get through this dungeon, if you don't want the player characters being super cautious the whole entire dungeon and examining every little thing for traps, but you do want there to be traps, what you can do is wait until later. Wait until, the final room where the treasure is and trap that, or wait until the room before the boss fight and trap that, or something like that. So basically, the way I think about it when I'm making a dungeon is, the first point in that dungeon where the player characters encounter a trap is the point at which I'm pretty much guaranteed they're going to start searching for traps all the time. They might do it beforehand. You do have players who are experienced dungeon crawlers, and from minute one, they're going to be looking for traps no matter what. And there's nothing you can do about that. Other than if they keep looking for traps and not finding traps, they might eventually kind of slack off on that. And that's when you spring a trap on them. But yeah, keep that in mind, So if you're like, hey, I got this dungeon, I want to use traps, but I don't want to have the party like agonizing over traps for the whole dungeon, save the traps for the very end. And that way, even if you have paranoid players that are looking for traps all the time, after searching 20 rooms for traps and not finding any, they're probably going to not look as hard and not look as often. And then maybe, the one trap you put in at the end might actually catch them by surprise. And then they'll be like, of course, consequences, right? Let's think about this, right? Thought experiment. I've created this dungeon. Let's say I've got 50 rooms in the dungeon. I don't put any traps in any of the rooms except for the final room where the boss is. Or maybe let's say a final room where the boss is. I put like all kinds of really nasty traps in there, or the room leading up to it, right? My player characters start playing in my dungeon. They diligently search for traps and do everything they're supposed to do for the first, say, 30 rooms or so. They don't find any traps. They're like, okay, there's no traps in here. We're going to stop wasting everyone's time looking for traps. They stop looking. And then that last room, I spring this super deadly trap on them. They didn't look for it, so it totally catches them unaware, maybe kills a character or severely injures the party. And first of all, that could lead to disgruntled characters, which you may or may not care about. But it will kind of impress on them that experience. And the next time you run a dungeon with that group, they may be searching for traps in every single room, no matter what. So if that's not a result that you want, if you want to be able to run dungeons in the future where they're not searching for traps left and right everywhere, then maybe don't do that to them. So you got to think ahead. What are the consequences of this going to be? And are those consequences I want or not? But, that can be a great way to think about it as far as the pacing is if you don't want this dungeon crawl to be a crawl, save the traps for the later parts of the dungeon, and then at that point, the players can be super paranoid, but maybe in the beginning, they don't need to worry about it. And, you can save a bunch of time at the table by them not looking for traps. A nice way to handle it, if you want to be able to have traps at the end, but you want to save them for the end so you don't, have to have this slow pace through the entire dungeon, but you want to avoid the scenario I just talked about where springing all these traps at the end just ticks the players off and they feel like you tricked them, or it just makes them even more paranoid in the future. A great way to avoid that is when they're entering an area where now there's traps, telegraph that or foreshadow that in some way. That would be the perfect time to use the little trick of them finding a trap that's already been triggered with a dead victim in it. That will tell them, oh, we've entered an area of this dungeon that's trapped now. We better start looking for traps. And that will avoid a lot of the, oh, from now on, we're going to be super paranoid no matter what, because Lex got us that one time. Because that way I kind of gave them a hint, right? That, okay, now you guys should worry about traps. And then if they don't take that hint and they don't look for traps and one gets them, it's on them, right? And they'll probably see that and be like, oh, Lex warned us with that body we found in the spear trap and we should have started searching at that point and we didn't, right? So that's a very different impact psychologically on the players than a trap just comes out of nowhere in the last room of the dungeon and, now they feel like no matter what in the future, they have to search every room of every dungeon for traps. So something to think about and plan for. So finally, I just want to talk a little bit with you about the experience of traps in the game, whether as a player or as a GM or both. I'm really curious what your experiences with traps have been. Both as GM and player, do you like traps? As a GM, do you enjoy creating traps and putting them in your dungeons or your adventures? Do you find them fun during play when the player characters have to deal with a trap? Do you prefer mechanical traps or magical traps? Do you prefer simple traps or complex traps? Do you prefer traps that are super deadly or just a setback or what? What do you like about traps? Or do you not like traps as a DM? What about as a player? When you're playing the game, do you enjoy, say, a dungeon where there's a lot of traps to deal with? Or do you not? Or does it depend on the character you play? I can see or could imagine that if I'm playing a rogue, I'd be much more into traps than if I'm not. Especially, I mean, there's a lot of ways you can build a rogue in 5th edition, but especially if I really focus my rogue on picking locks and detecting traps and disabling traps and stuff like that, if that is really what my character was about, I would love a dungeon with tons of traps. And I would feel a little let down if I went through a whole dungeon and there were no traps, right? So I primarily run the game as a GM a lot more than I play it. So that's really my perception, is from the perspective of a DM when it comes to traps. And, it's funny. I realized something as I was preparing this episode is I thought that I loved traps, and I think that I love traps, but when I really think about it and when I use them in the game, I kind of feel like I don't really like traps. I feel they just feel static to me. And I think that's part of, in Xanathar's guide, when they talk about, more complicated traps and traps as whole encounters. I think they're maybe trying to address that traps just feel really static. It just feels like I roll a die and something happens and we go on, as opposed to an encounter with monsters or other NPCs that are much more dynamic. There's so many ways things can go. We could have a conversation instead of fight. There's just so much more happening there than often with a trap. And, I've read a lot of discussions about traps online, and people say, oh well, and I think maybe in Xanathar's guide it talks about this, like traps that just do damage are the most boring kinds of traps, and you should really have your traps do something more interesting than doing damage. Oh, you know what, I know what I'm thinking of. Matt Colville, friend of the show, Matt Colville, recently did a video on his YouTube channel about dungeons, and I found it really helpful. I've been making and running dungeons for a long time, and there wasn't anything in that I was like, oh, I've never thought of that before. But he just had a really concise way of presenting how to approach designing a dungeon that I thought, if I was going to tell someone how to design a dungeon, I thought he outlined it really well and had a really good kind of method of approaching it that I really liked, and really kind of kept it simple and straightforward and made a lot of sense to me. So definitely check out that video. I'll go ahead and put it in the show notes for you over at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey for this episode. So you can check that out. But he was talking about, I believe, I'm pretty sure it was him in that video that I'm getting this from. He was talking about how, a trap that just does damage is like the least interesting kind of traps. And he really likes traps that do something more interesting, like splitting the party up. So maybe some kind of like shoot trap that puts one or more members of the party on a whole nother level of the dungeon. And now you've got the party split, part of the party's on level 1, part of the party's on level 4, and now they're both fighting monsters all by themselves, and they're trying to get back together. It creates all this drama, right, in a way that just a pit trap doesn't. Or traps that in some other way prevent or hamper the player characters working together, like a portcullis that drops down and splits the party in two, and now one part of the party has to fight something or something like that. And I totally agree with him. Like, absolutely. The most boring trap is one that just does 1d10 damage, right? And definitely, if you can use a trap in a creative way to split the party or put them in a different area of the dungeon, or, put them from the frying pan into the fire, definitely do that. And that'll be much more engaging than a trap that just shoots poison needles at them. Like, I completely agree with that. But even with that, I still find traps far less interesting than other types of encounters with, monsters or people, So I'm just curious, maybe my thinking is just too limited in how I approach and use traps, because I want to like them. I always think of, like Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom, and the beginning sequence of Raiders of the Lost Ark with the giant rolling ball of stone that D&D riffed on for the trap we just talked about a few minutes ago. Those are such awesome and fun moments in those movies. All the Indiana Jones movies have cool traps in them. And, in a movie or a TV show or a book, traps can be really fun and cool and evocative and exciting. But at least in my experience as a GM and even as a player in D&D and other games, they just always fall short of that. I don't think ever had a trap in a game I ran or played that was able to capture that level of excitement. They always kind of seem kind of ho-hum to me. So I'm really curious what you think, how you like traps, how you use them. And if you have a similar feeling to me as they're not that much fun and I tend to use them less and less. I ran Hidden Shrine in Tamawakan, and you can see that on my YouTube channel. And it had a lot of traps. And by the end of that adventure, I was kind of like, I'd had it with traps. I was so sick of them. And, that was an adventure written by professionals. I mean, it was written a long time ago and edited and revised recently. And they couldn't make traps that held me through the whole adventure. By the end of the adventure, I was sick of them. So I don't know. I don't know if there is an answer, what the answer is. So if you have any thoughts on that, whether you agree with me or disagree with me, or maybe you found some strategies or specific types of traps or ways to use traps that are more fun for you and the players and aren't just kind of boring and feel almost like a waste of time, I'd love to hear your thoughts. GameMastersJourney@gmail.com. Let me know what you think. Let me know how you use traps in your game, if you use them or not. And how do you try to make them fun, not just for the players, but also for yourself? I'd love to hear from you. All right, that's going to wrap it up for episode 239 of Game Master's Journey. If you'd like to get a hold of me, there are a lot of great ways to do so. You can shoot me an email at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter @LexStarwalker, and you can call my voicemail 951-GMJ-LEX1. That's 951-465-5391. You can also join our community on MeWe and Discord. You can find links in the show notes to all that great stuff, starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey. If you have any comments, questions, or feedback for the show, I would love to hear from you. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to help support the show, you can find all the ways to do that at starwalkerstudios.com/support. The best way you can support the show and my RPG endeavors is to check out my latest self-published D&D supplement, Relics of Power. However you decide to support the show, I really, really appreciate it. I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I hope you have a chance to run your favorite RPG. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music, courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.